This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Stephen, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I'm still learning. That's who I am.
Who are you?
I am Dad.
Who are you?
I am husband.
Who are you?
I am son.
Who are you?
I am legacy.
Who are you?
I am community member.
Who are you?
I guess finally now I'm Stephen.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Stephen Jackson to the podcast. Stephen has been a restorative justice practitioner for 10 years and has facilitated and implemented various community and youth programs. In 2015, he started Global Community Associates, which is a restorative consulting firm. Stephen also works as a realtor, and he currently serves at the Oak Park Public Library in Illinois as the Teen Services Coordinator, where in 2016 he aided in the integration of social services into public libraries. In this episode, you will learn about a functioning restorative library, different ways you can help teens, and the importance of relationship building. As always, please check out our show notes below for all of our upcoming workshops and courses, and our YouTube channel and Instagram where we post a lot of podcast-related content. Without further ado, let's get into this episode.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get into all of those things and more because you didn't even talk about the work that you do, but that's okay. It's always good to just check in. We're not defined by our work, but let's check in to the fullest extent of the question or as much as you want to answer. How are you?
Still learning.
Tell me how you're feeling.
I'm feeling honored. It's been a while since I've seen you, and you were a resident of Chicago last time I saw you, so I'm honored to reconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Chicago was such a formative time and space for me, 2014 to 2019, meeting so many titans in this work. And you a little bit out west, Oak Park. We count you. You've been doing amazing restorative justice work, not just in the context of your role as manager of teen services at the Oak Park Public Library, but in the way that you move through the world. I'm curious, how did this restorative justice journey get started for you?
I guess it had to be around 2006, 2007. I was in Dixon Correctional Facility, and there was a program called Lifestyle Redirection, and it had all these elements that I later found out after I was released that were restorative practices. It wasn't framed as restorative practices at the time that I was doing it, but once I got the language, I was like, oh, that's what that was. So that was my first introduction. And then later on in about 2010, I started really like getting language, getting trained, and serving my apprenticeship.
Yeah. So much of this work that people do around these words restorative justice aren't necessarily tied to the words restorative justice. What was it about the work in that program that really resonated with you?
It was the vulnerability. I was in prison, and like you had killers, rapists, you name it, and those are just some of the worst, or what will be deemed as some of the worst types of crimes of people that were in this space. Um, all in the same space, all these men in the same space, and just being completely vulnerable, defining men's roles, talking about domestic violence, just talking about a bunch of different things, and just sharing and with confidentiality, and like it created a brotherhood of different cohorts of people who went through this program. It was done in a circle. Um, all the facilitators were women, but like it was nothing wrong with that. But I'm just remembering and recalling. But it was the safeness of the space that really like impacted a lot of men,
Including yourself. And I think, as men, right? And we were talking about this 2 episodes ago with Carlos Malave, who was sharing similar things about like the vulnerability that it takes to do this work is not something that we were socialized to do, right? You've got to be hard, you've got to be tough. What was it like being introduced in that way to this process in a space that is not vulnerable? Like you are vulnerable when you are in prison, but like you're taught to even more protect yourself. What was it like to go through that process while in a space like that?
What's really tripped out is when you were talking about what I consider an exercise that I took from one of the exercises one of the facilitators did is the man box. It was an exercise called the man box.
Yeah.
And what they did is they drew a box on the whiteboard, and then they just started saying, just for association, what makes a man? What things were you taught as being a man? And then some of the things you were just saying, they filled up this box and like, and then asked the question, I was like, man, how reasonable is it to believe that you can be all of these things that we put in this box? And it hit me, and I was like, it's a great exercise. Not only is it a great exercise, but it really resonated. It resonated with a lot of people. So that particular exercise, I recalled that when you were saying the different roles that men, people who identify as men, take on.
Yeah. And like, that's not something that we are even taught to think about. It's just like the expectation. And I think I remember, Shedrick Sanders, he mentioned that on like one of the earlier episodes of this podcast as well, that exercise being a transformative thing where it's like, hey, you can't live up to this standard of, well, nobody lives up to this standard. So like, why don't you just be yourself in this space? And like who you are is okay. There are things about you that we want to change to be like more human, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to live up to this expectation of all of these things that we think men have to be. You transition out of that space and learn more formal words for restorative justice. What was that learning process like? Who were your teachers? What were the spaces?
Shell Graves and
Episode number 1 of this podcast. Episode number, I think, 7 of this podcast. Shout out to the OGs.
Yeah, to the
Go
OG
ahead.
sensei. I call them my senseis. But it was amazing. It was transformative. Like it really like it brought everything together. For me, I was able to really just dive headfirst into the work, and like we were trained with community members. They trained community members,
Mm-hmm.
and it was groundbreaking for the community members that were there. And when I look now of that group that I'm still associated with, one is a mayor of Oak Park now. One is doing amazing work, equity work in the community. It was a cohort of about 20. So like I'm just thinking of the people that I still associate with on a regular basis. But yeah, it was transforming, just to answer your question.
Yeah. And I think, one of those things that happens in Cheryl and Pam, and, I don't know if Aura was a part of that.
She was, but she wasn't a part of that train, that particular train.
Gotcha. Aura is another one of those OGs who's now passed 3 years ago. But, doing that work in those spaces with them, learning circle practices, really allows us to share. And you've brought that into so many different parts of your life. Before we were recording, you were telling me on this call that, for you, restorative practices, restorative justice is not just about, the programs that you do, the questions that you ask. It is about how you move through the world. This being this restorative justice life and life covering all the things, how has this way of being impacted the way that you've moved through the world, and in all of the ways? We can start with your family, or we can start with work. Where do you want to go?
We'll start with family. My wife, shout out to Dr. Celeste Jackson.
Hey.
My right hand. She's a PhD in community psychology. And like when we met, we were meeting around some of her research. We met around some of her research, and it's just been a part of our life, a part of our business, a part of everything that we do, part of our real estate business, a part of our mental health counseling business, part of our consulting business. It's just ingrained in everything because, like you said, it's a way of being. It's a way of life. It's a lifestyle, not necessarily a methodology or anything like that. The way I was taught is you have an onus placed on you throughout the rest of your life because you are a peacekeeper. So I was also taught that when you become an elder not necessarily defined as age, but defined as 3 components. Having the knowledge and wisdom. A lot of people have those too, but the third and one of the most important components of the 3 is respect from the community. So if you don't have those those 3 components, some say that you're not necessarily don't qualify as being an elder. So carrying those 3 components everywhere you go. People look at you anywhere I go in any community, maybe in academia, in Austin, in Oak Park, Roseland, anywhere I go, there's a level of respect because it's reciprocated. It's the way I treat people that gives me the respect of the community or the spaces that I occupy. So they permeate everything. We can go to work.
Well, let's go back, because you talked about a bunch of different places where you're doing work, but when you're talking about your family, with your wife, now with your children, these principles of interconnection and respect and equity, how do those manifest in those relationships?
With my children, they have a say. The only time that I bring in me being the overriding decision maker in the situation is if it's life or death. And then they still deserve an explanation of why my behavior was the way it was. So say, for instance, if my son runs in the street and I scream and I have to go run and scoop him or whatever, or when I tell him, hey, you can't go across the street. And I can't tell him in the moment because his life may be in danger, which just ironically happened this morning. I was on a bike ride with my son and he was just rolled out into traffic, but with my family, everyone has a say-so. Everyone has a voice and everyone deserves an explanation, especially when it impacts them. And all my decisions impact my family as me being the father and the head of the household.
Yeah. Can you think of a concrete situation, whether big or small, and what did that look like?
Because I have a 2-month-old and I have a like I told you, a 20-month-old, and then my soon to be 9-year-old, he doesn't live with me. So it's few and far between when I have to, we FaceTime and have conversations over the phone. Okay, I can think of one. There was an instance where he was being my soon to be 9-year-old was being disrespectful towards his mother. So she called me, had me FaceTime him, and there was reasons why he was showing up the way he was, though I didn't necessarily agree with the way he treated his mother. But a shout out to his mom, and no disrespect to his mom. But I created a space where he could actually have a conversation and share why he was showing up the way he was showing up. And I wasn't necessarily defining him by the actions or the words that he was saying to his mother. I was defining him by who he was, and gave him my opportunity to have a voice. Some people are raised, do as I say, not as I do. And do as you're told or be seen and not heard. And that's just not restorative
Right.
at all. So to allow a 7-year-old, because he's 7 at the time, to have a voice, it empowers him. So he's one of the most inquisitive people, as most 6, 7, soon to be 9-year-old now are. But he knows that his voice is respected and valued and has merit in situations in life where it involves him.
Definitely. And I think two things are coming up for me. I'm laughing because sometimes people say like, oh, I notice like whatever you're going through in life shows up in this podcast. And in some ways that's true. The James Baldwin quote about children have never been very good at listening to what they've been told, but never fail to imitate their elders, right, has come up in like probably the last 4 or 5 episodes, right? And I was just talking about that in a workshop that I was running earlier today, where that do as I say, not as I do, like doesn't really work. But the other thing that I'm thinking about is how right now I'm reading with a couple of friends, All About Love by Bell Hooks. And when she's talking about, the need for parents to have like another voice, or like adults having partnership in raising children, to be that other voice when you just can't with your child, right? And having somebody to be able to help zoom out and think about like, hey, let's hear what this young person who's full of knowledge, full of desires in the world, let's hear them out, and like how can we get to where we're meeting folks' needs, not just getting anybody's way just because that's what they want.
It's fun to see. It's fun to see because you see a light go off in young people's minds when they realize they can advocate for themselves, or someone is respecting what they're saying.
Yeah. Absolutely. Speaking of young people, right? Some of the work that you do is directly tied to young people, right? One of the reasons that I reached out is a lot of people do restorative justice work within the context of the criminal legal system or within the context of schools. And that work is all needed, and that work is really valuable. A lot of times when we're working within that system, that work is harm reductive, if not transformative. But you brought this work, like you said, wherever you go. One of those roles is as the manager of teen services with the Oak Park Library. So what does a restorative library look like?
A restorative library looks like a place where the community informs how we move as an organization. Several years back, our executive director went on this path. It's called the Harwood Innovation Lab. A lot of everything, majority of what Harwood spoke about or speaks about is restorative, but it wasn't necessarily called restorative. So it was really community centered, everything. So we formulated our strategic plan and our mission and our vision around the community. We used to have community conversations, which were like little mini circles, but they weren't called that. where we listened to the community, and then we integrated everything that they said and formulated our mission, our vision, and our values and our strategic plan. So that, to me, what a restorative library would look like. And we revise. We always listen to our community, and they, like I said, I can keep reiterating, they inform what we do. And for me, that's what a restorative library looks like. Another component is my journey into the library came on when social services were being integrated within public libraries. For those who don't know much about libraries or inner city libraries or urban libraries, there are a lot of populations who occupy the space who may be considered vulnerable populations. And from my perspective, teens are vulnerable population, but people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are experiencing substance use or substance abuse issues or co-occurring issues sometimes frequent the libraries. So they're in need of service, and library is a public facing organization, and those people need resources. So when we came in 2016 under the social services department, we did that. We listened to the community, found out 10 different domains where people needed resources, and partnered with over 52 organizations throughout the Chicagoland area to refer patrons who shared with us through an outreach model where we interacted with patrons and just had restorative conversation, restorative chat, just conversations with people, built relationships with them. And then they share certain information with us where it was like, did you know we have a social worker? Or some of the staff, the outreach staff, who are called public safety, will have conversations with the patrons and inform both Robert Simmons, who is the director of public safety and social services, and let us know and refer them to us. And then we're able to have a conversation with them and have them access the resources that are available to them to help move them or transition them into the next phase of their life. So that to me is what a restorative library looks like. A restorative library looks like a library where you throw a barbershop in it to create an environment where people can come in and have barbershops are sort of a restorative environment to begin with, because people come in and are able to express themselves freely and not necessarily feel judged in doing so. We've created that. So this is just a number of ways, and the community informed these things that we've been doing at the library. So there's just a number of ways. Just listening to the community is to sum it all up.
I was gonna say, I like how you're emphasizing, like, it's listening to the people who are most impacted, right? The community, and the specifics of those things are gonna depend on the needs of any given community, right? I'm curious, within the context of Oak Park, you mentioned two things. One, about those initial community conversations around mission, vision, and like the overall trajectory of the library. What was the community input there? And then two, like when you're having those individual conversations with vulnerable community members, how does that look? But let's start with like that overall community conversation. What is the input that they were asking for with the trajectory of library services?
What do you want your community to look like? It was really general questions of what do you want to, how do you see your community looking? Like what services do you need? There were three really general questions, and I'm failing to recall at the moment, but I do remember one was, what do you want your community to look like? And we compiled all this information and started moving in that direction. And here we are.
Do you remember the takeaways? The general takeaways?
They were looking for equity. They were looking for access. They were looking to learn. Fine free ultimately ended up being, so we don't have any fines at our library. Those are things that come up just right now.
Yeah. And then so, that influences how you allocate funding, programs that you set up. And then when it comes to asking individuals who are vulnerable about, what they need, what do those conversations look like?
I want to go back to the other question because you made me, you helped me recall.
Yeah.
So now we also have an anti-racist strategic plan And I like to tell people when I share this, it wasn't a reaction to a George Floyd situation, because I've seen a lot of organizations be reactive after what has been happening in these communities was actually publicized nationally during the pandemic. And so these things have been going on prior. So our
Well,
organization
and I'll
works.
say for people who don't know what Oak Park is right west of Chicago, right? So you have the Austin neighborhood, which is a majority Black neighborhood, is often cited as one of the neighborhoods that has like the most gun violence, right? And then like 2 blocks over is Oak Park, right? Which is a much more racially diverse neighborhood. And within that diversity, right, many communities being represented, racism still exists. And so, issues of racism did not just pop off because someone was murdered by police a couple 100 miles away in Minnesota, right? These issues have been long lasting in that community.
Exactly. Austin was a community that moved in the late 80s. It's one of the communities in the Chicagoland area that has the most returning citizens in the state. So Oak Park has, I'm just giving you a little bit about Oak Park. For those who didn't know, Oak Park has about 55,000 people. The community to the west will be River Forest. They have about 10,000. Forest Park, another, has about 13,000. Austin has a little under 100,000, 97,000. And the other community to the south will be Berwyn. They have 54,000. And of those surrounding communities of Oak Park has a 97% high school diploma graduation rate. River Forest has a 99%. Forest Park 95. Austin has a 36% graduation rate, and Berwyn has an 80. So when you talk about Austin versus Oak Park, that would look like a 97 versus 36% graduation rate. And then if you look at those who have a bachelor's degree or greater, Oak Park would be at 70. Austin would be at an 8.9. Little under 9%. So if you see the disparity, and then when you look at income, Oak Park 94,000, River Forest 129, and this is that median income. Forest Park 62, Austin at 31. And then if we look at poverty, and this is the last category I'll share, Austin is at 29%, a little under 29%. Those percentage of the people in Austin are in poverty. You look at the other communities are all in single digits, except for Berwyn. Berwyn is like 12, a little bit over 12, but River Forest is 3.6% of people that live in poverty. So just wanted to give those who didn't know about Oak Park a little overview of the disparity from Austin to Oak Park, and even with Berwyn and other surrounding communities.
And so when we're talking about bringing anti-racism, like the need for it did not just start. Anti-racism work and equity work, it's not just that these problems suddenly arose, right?
Right. So we started on the path prior to, as I mentioned, the George Floyd incident. And then the work continued once the pandemic hit. We were able to have the wonderful and great Robert Spicer come in.
Episode number 11-ish on this podcast, like shouting out all the OGs here.
Yeah. He was able to come in and train 15 of our staff. And then he was able to come in a year into the pandemic and train another 12 to 13. So now we have about 23 to 25 staff members trained. And staff members are living the restorative principles, and this is restorative life in a restorative environment at the workplace. And we started internally, and that was so awesome because it allowed them to really experience it versus being trained and trying to turn outward into the community and try to do it. So we were able to, people were able to have bumps and bruises with each other, which they knew, and bring people together on a more personal level and a respect level. So a little bit of the work in the work environment
Yeah.
when we talk
What does
about
that look
restorative.
like? Like it's community building. What does that look like in practice, especially during pandemic times?
We were virtual, but
Mhm.
which I didn't really think possible. But after being in a year plus, where I was able to conceptualize it even more and experience and receive it better. But what it looks like is support circles, because as you know, a lot of people experience a lot of death. We lost one employee to COVID, a really key uh, staff member who was doing amazing work. So grief, circles. So people just staff was able just to be supported and have their voices heard at a time when people were isolated. It allowed people to experience what some of the patrons that came in the library experienced, were socially isolated. So when you talk about the pandemic, a lot of people had already experienced social isolation their whole lives. So like this wasn't any different than what they were already experiencing. But for the staff, some of the staff to be able to have conversations around what they're experiencing was really key. And for a lot of the staff members to engage at a time when a lot of people were engaging.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like when these staff members now have this way of being ingrained, right? And of course it's a journey for everybody, right? To fully embody. Nobody has reached perfection in this. And I'm sure that there are some staff members that are more on board than others, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You're now in the position where you get to have these conversations with individuals who are experiencing harm, looking for services. What do those conversations look like? I guess like before and after these pandemic times. I know you said you're going back. Well, the week that this podcast airs, you will be back in person.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, what does that look like? What have those conversations with community members look like on an individual level?
How are you doing today? I'm Steven Jackson, the manager of team services. I've seen you around here a couple of times. Just wanted to let you know some of the things that we have going today. This is what I do, just share a little bit about myself, ask them their name, check in with them. And usually it's, oddly enough, um, we have regulars in the library, people who like this is their thing, show up every day. So more than likely, you'll see people more than one time in a week or more than once. So when you see a person coming back regularly, that to me is the opportunity to have more conversation with this person. And I stand at the front of the building every day at 3 o'clock, 5 days a week, and welcome all young people because that was my specific area of service. But I would stand at the door and welcome and introduce myself and ask them their names and shake their hands and give them a smile. That's what it looks like for me. That's what engagement looks like to that vulnerable population. But to others with more adults, it's just having a conversation with them. As simple as that, having a conversation, introducing yourself in an environment where, because possibly the way they show up, people are going the opposite direction of them or calling the police on them. So it just wasn't my approach. I'd rather have a conversation with you, get introduce myself, allow you to get to know me, and me get to know you.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about how what you said was very simple. Like, how are you? This is who I am, and this is what we got going on. But like, that's not often the approach that people take when it's in a lot of ways like customer service. It's just like, how can I help you? What do you need? Without like that relationship, that opening up into who you are, into the beginning of our conversation, right? When you're being vulnerable and putting yourself out there, like, hey, this is who I am, this is what I'm about, like people are a lot more likely to reciprocate. One of the 7 core assumptions of restorative justice, right? Thinking about, all humans want to be in a good relationship. We are wired to want to be liked, to want to be in good relationship. And when somebody demonstrates that kind of vulnerability, that kind of care, you're a lot more likely to have a positive interaction and be able to start to build a relationship. I'm not saying that you're best friends with everybody, right?
Right.
But the simplicity of how are you, and introducing yourself and sharing vulnerably. And I'm not saying share everything that has ever happened to you in your life, but like, no, this is who I am, and I'm here, is a shift for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. It is. It really is. It was a culture shock for the library, seeing two Black men in administrative positions in the library spaces, which historically they mirror the teaching profession.
Mm-hmm.
Library profession, the teaching profession, they mirror each other in demographics. Largely woman, female dominated, at least at the ground level. Just like in academia as well, in school environment, male domination at the administrative level, but majority dominated by female. Library is the same, a lot the same. So like having like people come in like with a sense of ownership, because I grew up in Oak Park, so like I know everybody there. I knew a lot of people, and I have history in the community. So people are looking at me like, who does he think he is? Some people even said as much. And just having conversations with random people, something that they've never seen in the space. And now it's culture.
Yeah. Yeah. What does that look like? You're doing work specifically with teens. I know the last year and a half has been a little bit different, but what has that looked like historically, and what are you hoping to get back into?
So during this process, prior to this, the pandemic, we didn't have a dedicated teen space. Mm-hmm. So now post-pandemic, we are awaiting in a few days our second to last piece of furniture. So we now have a dedicated teen space. So it'll look different than it did prior to. What I found out is the organization is prioritizing young people. And I can't say that necessarily was the case in years past, because teens didn't have a dedicated space, and everybody else had something that said, hey, this is for you. We have a first floor that is totally children services, like the whole floor. Then we have the second floor was a little bit more social. So teens found a little area, corner, and they turned up, because nothing really told them that this is for you. They just made it theirs, and, did age appropriate things. Like a lot, oftentimes I tell people, teens' brains are still developing. So like their amygdala is just firing off. And they're really impulsive just because their brains are developing. So we can't expect them to do certain things without setting the expectation and having conversations with them to have these expectations. But we have intentionally focused on teen services to the point where we've separated. Prior to me being there, it was adult and teen services, and they separated teen services from adult services and prioritized it more. So I now manage teen services. So the sky's not even a limit with what we're doing. And they designed the space. They were able to design the space. So they'll be able to help set it up. So it's really awesome. A lot of stuff that we're doing with them and focusing specifically on them and allowing their voice. So we've created an advisory board that when we want to do things, we go to this group and have conversations about them and what direction to go. One of the teams actually we created contests for them to win cash prizes. A team designed the logo for the teen services department, and was compensated first, second, and third place. They were compensated for it. So having a sense of ownership of something. Imagine designing a logo for the teen services of your local library. You can go in there and show your kids one day, I did that. I remember when so just allowing them to feel, not allowing, but creating a space for them to create what they want to see is what our department looks like. Everything that we do is informed by them.
Yeah. What are some of the things that are coming down the pipe?
So we have an environmental club that has been meeting, and they've adopted a block. So they do that once a month. The board is getting full. So we're about to have an election process. now. Now that we have a bunch of teams that are really involved, we have a mural project where they're going to paint canvases, and so there'll be wall canvases of their of what they want on these walls in this teen space. We just had an ice cream social. It was a recruitment event that the board created. We partnered with Andy's Custard, and they provided the ice cream, and we were just in the park. Shout out to Darcel Washington and Alice Gutierrez, and our newest member of the team, Amy. I cannot pronounce her last name. I cannot pronounce it. I'm meet with Amy tomorrow, and I'm gonna get it right. I don't want to butcher it, but Amy H, the newest member of the team as well. So we're just building right now. We're really building and building a team that are going to intentionally focus on young people.
Yeah, absolutely. The community input is such a big part of this, right? A lot of times when I talk about restorative justice, a lot of times people are just like, how do you repair the harm? How do you repair the harm? And that's a part of it, right? How do we make sure that we have something to restore to in the first place, though, is super important as well. The ways that we're building and maintaining relationships, one, will prevent harm, but when there is harm, within the context of the library and your programs, how have you all like restoratively navigated some of those things?
We've had parents
Mm-hmm.
come in and young people sit down in a circle and resolve issues where sometimes police will be involved, even to the point that we invited the police officer that was a part of the situation to the circle, but they were on another call. They couldn't make it that day. But to the point that having people sit down in the space, and like we came to some really sobering realities of the trauma that the perpetrator was experiencing that took him to the level where he did what he did. And like people sympathize with the perpetrator, even the parents of the person harmed, and the person who was harmed was able to like understand more why this person was showing up the way they showed up. This person was experiencing grief, had lost one of his best friends since childhood. Just suddenly had an asthma attack and died, and he had been acting out ever since this happened, and this wasn't different where he was acting out in this way. But we built relationships with the families, and we're able to call up the family, call up mom, dad, grandma, and then have them come in and have these conversations and build relationships with the person harmed and the person who was perpetrating the harm. That was one incident that I can remember specifically where it was just super dope to see the process work, at least the circle process work in repairing the harm that was done.
Yeah, and when I think about police being called, right, and you talk about vulnerable populations, like this is like life-threatening, right? And there are other ways. There are other ways of dealing with harm. Is that something that you are building into teen services and library practices, like not having to call the police?
Yeah, so when we do call the police, so the only time we do call the police is when life-threatening, like danger. It's just certain times that like we don't have the resources to handle the situation. But when we do call, like I said, I've grown up in the community. I know a lot of the guys, some of the guys I went to high school with that are on the force, and then our police forces train, crisis intervention train. So they have a level of training that where they're not as punitive. And when you have a relationship with people, they show up different, So I meet them at the door and be like, hey, David, this is what's going on. We just need you to escort this person out today. Just today. This person did this. We told this person multiple times. They continue to do this. And this is usually the way it happens. We told this person multiple times they can't do it, and there'll be a consequence if they don't. And this was the consequence. They can't be here today, or they can't be here for the remainder of the week. But after this day, they can come back. We'll welcome them back. And we're going to actually really welcome them back when they do come back. And just because we don't have the capacity to, we don't have the authority sometimes to, until you build that relationship with them. So if I tell, it's gotten to the point now where certain teens, like if they come in doing what we told them, hey, you can't do that here, they'll be like, all right, Mr. Jackson. I was like, well, you can't be here today. Come back tomorrow. And they'll come back tomorrow and they'll change the behavior just because they know that there is a consequence. I've had a conversation with them. I actually know their name. In times past where people just call the police, don't have a relationship with these young people to even speak life into their lives or have a respect level where they're actually going to adhere to what you say. And most times, if I don't know you, usually that's when situations usually turn out like that. But once they get to know me and our staff, they'll know like, man, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Washington, Mr. Gutierrez, and they're not trying to jam us up. They actually care about us.
Mm-hmm.
One story, quick story. Storytelling is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
As I was building the department, there's a group of teens that came in and were having this behavior that people in the library just weren't really fond of. So I knew all of them. So I, with intention, started calling them into my office every day. 3 o'clock, 3:15, when I got there, called them in my office, put them in a circle, go around and check in. One of the kids said, one question was, how was your day? One of the rounds was, how was your day? It wasn't to say, you did this yesterday or anything like that. It was just to check in with them. And I just started checking in with them every day. And one kid said, Mr. Jackson, man, it's really dope that you asked this question because there's only one person that asked me that question, and that's my mom. When she gets in from work at night, no one asks me how my day is. And I was like, that's really tripped out that no one asks you how your day but one person. And it really resonated with me that they're used to having interactions that are punitive in a school environment and used to be at the library environment. But now they have a space where they know they can come in and people are going to check on their well-being.
Yeah. I mean, punitive at worst and maybe just transactional at best, right? Where it's like, hey, this is what it is. Do what you need to do and on to the next class, or here's the book that you need, here's program's over, time to go. Yeah. So much of this is just the relationships. And, shout out to Cheryl in a lot of ways. Restorative justice is, how are you and what do you need? And we go from there.
And those are the questions that we ask with the vulnerable patients. We don't go, what's wrong? We're not doing that. How are you? What do you need? Our staff, public safety staff, are trained with mental health first aid as well as trauma informed. So they come in and we make sure they can get these baseline level trainings to sort of show them how to engage or make sure that they have these skills to engage with the patients on the level where we treat them like human beings.
There are two things. It's a shift to adapt, but then it's also a shift to be able to be responsive to the things that people say, right? Because you can't just be asking those questions to be like, all right, cool, later. Right? You got to be able to respond, and the intentions of you were just talking about the way that you've intentionally built partnerships with people in the community to be able to respond to those needs is so important. How did those partnerships come up?
Relationships with people.
Okay, sure. So what's an example of one of those partnerships and relationships?
So our director of public safety, he is a very, very, very extensive network of people. I'll use an example of an instance where I built a partnership with Rush Chicago. So at our public library, we give on Wednesdays free mental health assessments from Rush Hospital. So they have clinicians coming in, and the reason this came about because as I was doing a presentation, university leadership course, and I was one of the guest speakers about some of the resources that we have in the community, and like we were getting our butts handed to us with people who were having issues with mental health, and there was just no mental health infrastructure that didn't have a fee associated with it in Oak Park.
Mm-hmm.
So Rush Oak Park, they have a Rush in Oak Park. I had a conversation with Darlene Hightower. Shout out to Darlene. And she was like, well, we don't have mental health infrastructure here in Oak Park, but I can connect you with Rush Chicago and see what they can do. So by me having that conversation in relationship with Diane, I was able to reach out to Rush Chicago and facilitate a partnership where we now have free mental health assessments, which is not many places. Those are at least $150, as I am about to be a mental health clinician.
Mm-hmm.
That's $150 to $200 straight out the gate to get that intake assessment. And now we built infrastructure now where people are getting 4 free sessions. Not only are they getting assessment, but they're getting 4 free sessions. And this is out of a library, your local library. You can go to your local library, your confidentiality be protected, and you can have this mental health assessment, and you can get 4 free sessions. So we were able to, because we knew these people, we were able to reach out to them, tell them a need that we had and how could it be mutually beneficial. And we just made it happen. Rob, shout out to Rob, shout out to Kristen from Rush Chicago and Dr. K. Like, it was just people that like made it happen just because there was a need there. And it was because of relationships that we had in the form of people, not necessarily organizations. And that's the way it is with our patrons. We do a warm handoff. We're introducing them to people, not organization. There's an organization attached to these people, but these are people, and when we introduce them to the people. And when you do that, there's a level of accountability, because there's a lot of organizations that have a mission and a vision, will collect people's personally identifiable information and use that to get funding, but not necessarily provide the services that they are supposed to be providing. And that's what happens with vulnerable populations. And when you have relationships with people, there's a level of accountability where that's not happening.
Yeah. I think like that's such a beautiful example, specifically as someone who has health insurance, right? And has engaged in therapy at $50 a session, right? So that's $200 a month if you're going weekly, to be able to have some kind of services like existing at the place where you go check out books and I was going to say DVDs, but then I was dating myself back to like when I was in high school and going actually to the library.
We still have them. We still have DVDs, unfortunately.
No, that's really beautiful. And I think the other part of that is, the relationships, but you also have to ask, right? Asking people, because I do think there are people who want to help, right? There are people who might not necessarily be like, abolish the police, defund the police, right? But if you're saying from the perspective of somebody who's working in a library, like, hey, we have these people in our community who need these services, can you help out? Right. And shout out to the people who step up and do that, right? As much as we can say, like, if we defund this part of the police and turn it towards mental health services, like, I also think like people should be able to like make that connection, but who am I to judge? Like, whatever way, I think like there's an ideological purity that sometimes we can get lost in when like we can access help and resources for people in another way. It doesn't always have to be about getting the ideologically pure wins.
Yeah, when you talk about defunding the police, I think this is like a trigger topic for a lot of people. And I think it's just because of semantics, because what it is reallocating is really what people are saying. We want you to reallocate. And then even with the abolitionists, I think that if you pose something to them such as only people from the community can hold these positions, I think it would look different. Imagine if we'll use Oak Park as an example, only residents of Oak Park could be police officers in Oak Park. Mm. You know what I mean? There's a different level of accountability.
Yeah. Well, and I think like if you scale that up to Chicago, right? Chicago's a really big city. And I think
but we have neighborhoods. You know, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods. It's like anywhere, but like Austin, you have to live in Austin. You have to live in Woodline. You have to live in Inglewood. Like you wouldn't mistreat. The force would look different, first of all, in these communities that I'm talking about. People would look like them who you would know people. Yeah. Like, what would I look like mistreating Miss Johnson's son when I went to school? And I'm like, it's hard to mistreat someone when you know their mom. That's what I tell people all the time. Yeah. When you know your mom, this person's mom, it's hard to mistreat this person.
Yeah, and I think like we apply that to people who are gang involved, right? Like we talk about like street intervention. When you know that this is John who's walking his brother to school through your block, but you know that he's walking his brother to school because of whatever's going on in his life. That's one thing, and he gets a pass, right? But if you don't know him, we're at ops. It's tough for me. I do think that there is a way that community safety, there's a role for people who help keep community safe. To adapt the current police force to look like those ways of making communities safe, like it's hard for me to draw those connections, because like in order to be a part of that police force, there's training, there's lots of training and things that are on the books and like things that are off the books, right? The culture of policing requires somebody to do. So even if you are from that neighborhood, right? Even if you're someone who wants to protect people in your neighborhood, that job asks you to do things that like are causing harm inherently.
Yeah, true. Street organizations came about because of what we're talking about.
Right.
And they got corrupted because of the influx of drugs and in the community, which were placed there. But and I don't know how many people know the history of gangs, but like
I'm trying to remember like how much we went into it with the Vice Lords. Derek Brown was on this podcast. Okay. And I think we touched on it a little bit. I think that's episode 5. But yeah, like
there were community organizations.
Right.
Like they were to help carry Miss Johnson's groceries, to provide air conditioners for seniors in the summer when they don't have them, like doing things like that. Like so, when people say gangs, there's no negative connotation that comes with that with me, as I was a gang member at one point in time. But I know the history. I know my history, so I understand it on a different level.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to judge. I don't know this next person's plight.
For sure, there's not. I'll say like that's not like this restorative way of being, right? Mm-hmm. It's not for us to judge. It's just be like, this is where you are. How are you? What do you need? And within our capacity as individuals, within our capacity as members of organizations, members of communities, how can we be responsive to the members of the needs of our community? I think I said that right. We're getting to that time where I want to transition to the questions that I ask everyone. We've talked about it in a number of different ways, but define restorative justice.
I guess I would define it as an approach to repairing and addressing harm done within the community. It could also emphasize that every voice is being heard in a situation. And for me, like this person, I think restorative justice is sometimes, and justifiably so, a lot of times reactive. and versus restorative practices being proactive, and that where you don't have to use certain strategies or certain reactive restorative justice strategies to handle a situation. So, for example, restorative practices would be some of the things that we were talking about: meeting people, saying hello, building a relationship, um, versus restorative justice being having to have a conflict circle, because and conflict usually happens when people don't really know each other and know what's going on with people. But when you build relationships and doing proactive things such as having conversation, restorative chats, getting to know people, asking their name, asking them how they are, what do they need, so stuff like that. Restorative practices are more proactive. So I don't know. I think that makes sense to me, at least in my mind.
Perfect. That's beautiful. What was a moment that was like, oh shit, or like a moment that you messed up doing this work? What did you learn from it?
Oh my God. Like, I'm trying to think of which situation. Like, there were two that were like, one was a racism circle. I was so new in the game, and I didn't have, I was trained, but I didn't have my sensei with me in this situation. So I shouldn't have went in. So it went completely south. But what I learned was, to someone new um, in the practice, you always have to have a sensei, and you have to have an apprenticeship stage in the work, because you can do more harm and give the practice a black eye, and do more harm than repairing the harm. So that's what I learned, because in that situation I definitely caused more harm and walked into, like, yeah, a really messed up situation. So have your OG. Have your OG on location.
There you go. There you go. Or at least on speed dial.
Yeah.
You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what question do you ask the circle?
4 people. This it sounds like the dinner party. Pam Purdy's dinner party.
Little bit of a twist.
I know. I see 4 people. Dead or alive. I would want to talk to my ancestors and sort of know. I would want to ask them who we are, because there's been so much confusion with people that look like me of who we actually are. And the more and more digging that I do, the more I realize a lot of us were here. When I say here, I say on this continent prior to other people getting here. And a lot of us don't really necessarily have the African ancestry that people say. Nothing against it, if you do, but we've been deceived. So I really want to, like, all my people, all 4 people. Like, that's my biggest question. Would be who we are. Who I'm talking about, my people from my bloodline are, because we've been, all that's been whitewashed. So we don't necessarily, so we call ourselves a color, or we associate ourselves with a continent in which we don't know if that's where we were from. So, like, it's a lot of confusion. And like the term that we identify ourselves has no legal standing in the court of law. Like, Black has no standing in the court of law. So, like, we're identifying ourselves, and legally we have no value. So I would want to talk to my people, the people who did this practice that we're talking about right now.
I shared on this last podcast that I'm working through the way that I asked this question. So, what is a place or situation that you witnessed recently where you wish people knew this way of being?
I was recently brokering. I'm a real estate agent, so I was brokering a deal, and like a person, the seller had like started being irrational after we had inspected the property. So I work with people who look like me. I don't necessarily know their genetic origin, but they look like me. So when we were in a historically white community, and it was just some really shady stuff going on. And I was like, man, I just wish like that they knew this way of being, or get to know people before they come up with these assumptions. Because I'm a dope dude, and like the people I work with are super dope people too. Like, there's no reason for you to be acting like this.
Yeah. As I was sharing, this work is often just pigeonholed into like schools and criminal legal system. Like, it belongs everywhere in those everyday interactions that exist within our job. You talked about the way that it works in the library and like this other part of what you do. What is one mantra or affirmation you want everyone listening to know?
I'm still learning. When people, when I say that, I took it from Neely Fuller Jr. Read some of his book, United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, textbook, workbook for thought, speech, and/or acting for victims of racism, white supremacy. So he says this when people ask him, and I heard and I thought about it, meditated on. I'm like, I'm using that, because no matter what you ask me how I am, how I am right now, I'm learning. And I was talking to a guy the other day. To me, you're gonna be learning till you die. So it keeps me humble because I really, really work hard to know content on certain things in my life. But when I come with this mantra, it keeps me humble to know that I don't know everything. Mm-hmm. I don't know as much as I think I know, and it keeps me in a vulnerable state to be receptive to new information.
Yeah, absolutely. Who's one person that I should have on this podcast?
It's a group of people called the Greater Good Foundation. Greater Good Foundation. Yeah. Greater Good Foundation. Josh, Cody, and East. So Joshua Easter, Charles Carter, and Cody Cotton. They make up a Greater Good Foundation. They're doing some amazing transcending work across the country.
Make that connect. Gotta send us the email. Gotcha.
I got you.
And finally, how can people support you and your work in all the ways that you want to be supported?
Get to know people, treat them with respect. Ask questions, and don't make assumptions. We're wired to have certain assumptions, but suspend judgment, and use your critical thinking box. That's how you can support everything that I do, because to me, critical thinking is a careful and deliberate determination to either accept, reject, or suspend judgment before making a decision. And until you have enough information, and then you can either accept or reject what's presented to you. So for me, that's how you can support what I do.
And if you happen to be in the greater Chicagoland area, how can people support the library, Oak Park?
You can go on our website at oppl.org/teens and check and see what we're doing. You can check out us on our anti-racism journey that we're on. We're about to hire a director of equity and inclusion. We're on a search now for that, so we're looking for that person. Groundbreaking things going on in libraries, in particular at the library that I'm at. So I'm happy to be a part of that. So oppl.org.
Beautiful. Do you want to? I'm just looking at LinkedIn. Global Community Associates.
That is my personal business. Yeah. Global Community, my consulting business, globalcommunityassociates.com. That is globalcommunityassociates.com. Check us out. Definitely.
Yeah.
Most
What are
definitely.
the things that people can experience with you there?
Training, staff development, just learning opportunities on both ends, mentorship, guidance, and as I said, trainings.
For both young people and adults?
Definitely. Definitely.
Beautiful.
Young people, it doesn't matter. Organizations, we work with everyone.
So yeah, we'll definitely have all of those things linked in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
Shout out to my wife who's holding it down right now, holding down 2 babies under 2 right now while I'm doing this. Like, she is the reason why I'm able to do all the things that I do. So shout out to her. She is like the dopest person on the planet. Like Celeste, Dr. Celeste Jackson. Check her out on all social media platforms. She's doing amazing things with her life and with my children, our children. So that's what I want to leave on, because that's where I'm about to go and spend time with the family.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for spending as much time as you have with us, sharing your stories, sharing your wisdom, sharing your experience. That's how we grow, and I'm really appreciative. I'm honored that you took the time to be with us. For everyone else listening, we'll be back next week with another episode. Take care till then.
Elise here. Thank you, Stephen, for all you had to offer in this awesome episode. Here are a couple things that I thought about. I really appreciated when Stephen brought up the point that restorative justice is often looked at as a circle or relationship building after the fact, as a more reactive approach. Instead, Stephen chooses to focus on restorative practices of relationship building as a proactive measure. As Stephen shared, relationship building can be as simple as saying hello and really checking in with people, not just on the surface level, but on the emotional level, and trying to build those relationships. Stephen demonstrates this in both his work environment and his home environment. How do you use restorative practices in your work and home life? He also said, when you have a relationship with people, they show up different. Another layer to practicing restorative justice as a way of life is to see how you show up. The next step of building relationships is encouraging yourself and others to be the best that we can be at any given moment. As Stephen said, when you have relationships with people, there's a level of accountability. How do you use relationships with others to promote a stronger community? Finally, I thought that Stephen really taught us to continue to learn. Sometimes we will show up imperfectly, and that's okay. We just need to be okay with learning. Stephen focuses a lot of time with teens, and as a teen myself, I find it so important to have students and adults alike be open to learning. We can all learn from each other if we let ourselves. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today, and don't forget to check out all of our social media links in the show notes below, as well as all of the ways that you can support Stephen. And with that, I will see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.